biggest claim to fame is he was a reporter with the Daily Cal. Things just kind of went up for there with him. He's Sacramento-based. He's an author and political analyst who had a lengthy career in print and broadcast journalism. He was the lead author on two books that you really need to read. This is the way history books should be written. One is called Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And that was the winner of the California Historical Society's annual book award, and Paving the Way, Women's Struggle for Political Equality in California. Steve had reporting stints at the San Francisco Examiner, United Press International LA Bureau, and many of you probably recognize him from his 23 years here in Sacramento at KCRA-TV, the NBC affiliate, doing the political, government, and public policy reporting. He contributed to NBC News, NBC Today Show, PBS Political Affairs Program, and he was California's only TV reporter covering the state capitol full time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Steve. Again, feel free to go ahead and put your questions or comments into chat or Q&A. And just to let everybody know, this meeting is being recorded. All right, Steve, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Gary, and welcome, Professor Napolitano. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks, Steve.
So I know you spent 7 years as president of the University of California. We're going to spend plenty of time talking about your tenure as UC president, but I do want to start off with a couple of important issues of the day that I think are in your wheelhouse. Before coming to the university, of course, you served nearly 5 years as President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security. So I want you to put on your DHS hat for a moment. We now have a president who has COVID. He's perhaps 6 days into his illness. We're not exactly sure. We have a couple of dozen ill people in the White House. We know that it's conceivable that the president's condition could worsen within the next week. From a national security standpoint, what are the implications? What would you be looking out for in a situation like this?
Well, I think when the president is ill and ill enough to be hospitalized, you always worry that our adversaries will somehow try to take advantage of that. And so I am sure that the nation's national security infrastructure has been on kind of a red alert since early Friday morning when the president tweeted that he had COVID. The fact that this happened in the midst of an election cycle is also a time when adversaries may try to take advantage of the dislocation going on in the United States. And so, again, we rely on them to have good intelligence analysis, good contact with our allies, and really leaning forward to make sure that the country stays safe.
How might they take advantage? Cyber attacks, for example?
Yeah, a cyber attack on the nation's critical infrastructure would be a great example. By the way, a nation's critical infrastructure also includes our election infrastructure. And so they'll be watching for any signals that is going on. There are lots of red flags that occur when there's an attack that is underway. So there are means for the country to intervene and forestall an attack. But again, it is kind of a high alert situation.
And when you were secretary, did you game plan different scenarios just routinely?
Yeah, we absolutely did. And actually, the day that President Obama was inaugurated in 2009 for his first term, there was an active threat of a potential bomber for the inauguration. And so I worked out with my predecessor, Michael Chertoff, that he would stay in his role as secretary throughout the whole day of the inauguration and into the next day, so that he could be in the command center and be working with all of our security and law enforcement agencies until they were able to run down that threat and make sure that the actual inauguration was secure.
I hadn't heard that story before. Are we making news tonight?
No, we may be, but it absolutely was the case.
I want to ask you one other question before we move on to university issues. Jennifer Granholm, who teaches public policy at Cal, alongside of you when you get off your sabbatical. Jennifer Granholm, along with Tom Ridge, who one of your predecessors as DHS secretary, they are co-chairs of a group called Vote Safe, which is concerned about efforts to delegitimize next month's elections, possible confusion on election night, even looking into possible violence by those who don't believe the election results. Again, from your perspective as Secretary of DHS, how concerned are you that this election really could turn quite ugly? And is there anything we can do to minimize it?
Well, I'm quite concerned, and I know Jennifer and Tom Ridge very well, and I know Vote Safe. And in addition to that, Tom Ridge, who was the first Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff was the second, I was the third, and Jay Johnson was the fourth. So the two Bush secretaries and the two Obama secretaries. We also have formed a C3 organization, Citizens for a Safe Democracy, and to communicate on a bipartisan basis that our election infrastructure is secure, that people need to vote and their votes need to be counted, and that people should stay calm while that happens. You know, our country is known for always having a peaceful transition of power, and we should expect nothing less in this election.
All right. So now on to university matters. When you look back at the history of the university, going back 152 years now, most of the UC presidents, certainly not all, but most have been members of the UC family before they become presidents. I'm thinking of Clark Kerr and Richard Atkinson and Robert Dines. They were chancellors, for example. Robert Gordon Sproul was a vice president university-wide. Despite your impressive resume as a U.S. attorney and attorney general and a governor of Arizona and the secretary of DHS, you came in without experience in academic leadership and had to deal with certain challenges that you hadn't dealt with before. Can you share with us what advice that you would give to your former self now, knowing what you know about UC and academic leadership?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really came to appreciate, but maybe didn't appreciate on my first days in office, was the degree to which the president of the university needs to consult with a variety of constituencies before making or announcing decisions. And one of the most important of those constituencies, obviously, is the faculty. You know, the University of California operates on the notion of shared governance between the administration and the regents and the faculty, and making sure that you know, I was reaching out to them adequately and really listening and including them was something that was a learned skill on my part. Was not something that came naturally to me on day one.
So you found that the faculty could be pretty vocal.
Absolutely, and it's you know what, and it's a great faculty, and I came to really appreciate them and find that that was one of the more enjoyable parts of the job, was to interact with the academic senate, and I would go meet with them on a monthly basis. I would give my report, and then it was open season. They could ask me whatever they wanted, and they sure did.
So let's span your 7 years, and let's start with the highlights, really. What would you consider to be your major successes as president of the university?
Well, I think a couple. One is we successfully completed the Merced 2020 project, and that campus is growing great guns, but we had to complete the build out of the campus, and we did it on time and on budget. I think that the work we did on carbon neutrality and the work we did in furtherance of our goal of being carbon neutral by 2025 was really quite significant, and that work is obviously still underway. I think that some of the decisions we made, particularly toward the end of my tenure, for example, the phase out of the SAT in the admissions process, that was really an important step for the university to take, and it took some doing to get us there.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's look at the flip side. Obviously, with any professional role, it's safe to say we all experience some low points. So go back a few years. There were some challenges that you experienced with the budget, for example, with tuition battles, some battles with legislators, highly publicized legislative audit. What was the biggest lesson that you learned from these?
Well, one of the things that I learned was that we couldn't just come to Sacramento and say, this is how much money we need, give it to us, because we're the University of California. That we really had to advocate and have a real strategy for advocating. We needed to include our alumni in that advocacy and other supporters of the university in that advocacy. The days when Sacramento would just open its pocketbook and fund the university are over. It just doesn't work that way anymore.
And I will say that many of your critics inside the legislature and elsewhere have said that you turned things around the last several years. And as a matter of fact, they lauded your leadership and became vocal supporters. How did you pull that off?
You know what? I think some learned humility, and also working in Sacramento is about personal relationships, and really trying to develop good personal relationships with legislators who had a particular impact on the university. People like Jose Medina, for example. And really, spending time on it.
So when you announced that you would retire, this was in 2019, retire as UC president, who could have thought that when you finally retired, we would be in the middle of a pandemic that would hit the nation and the world? It's been estimated, I've seen that the university has suffered more than $2 billion in terms of lost revenue and new expenses as a result of the pandemic. And so you had to face this situation in the months before your retirement. Can you just sort of walk us through the process of dealing with something like this? I mean, where did you start?
Well, I mean, the pandemic hit us in two ways. One is, we run all of these large teaching hospitals. We're a large healthcare provider. And we had to immediately stop doing a lot of the surgeries and other procedures at the university hospitals so that they could care for COVID-related patients. And in so doing, we had to get the necessary personal protective equipment and the masks and all of the other items that were in short supply across the country, and there was no national strategy for getting them. So it was kind of a jungle out there, and we really had to scurry to make sure that we had enough supplies so that our staff were able to provide care and were themselves safe. But a lot of the revenue loss in the first months was due to that cancellation of procedures at the hospitals. So between March 15th and May 15th, I think we lost something like $750 million at the hospitals. At the same time, we had to basically shut down the campuses and depopulate them and convert the classes to remote learning. And you know, that was something that fell heavily on the faculty, who had to immediately convert their teaching to a remote learning environment. It meant that we had to refund housing and dining fees. So in addition to the $750 million of lost revenue in the hospitals, we wrote checks for about $350 million for those refunds. Then we had to undertake the process for identifying or working to see at what point the university could safely resume in-person classroom instruction. And at what point and at what level could we repopulate the dorms? You know, that was complicated by the fact that we have campuses all over California. They're in different counties, so they were getting different guidance from different county health departments. We waited for months and months and months to get guidance from the state. We finally got some toward the very end of my tenure as president, when the decisions already had been made, because you know, Berkeley and Merced are semester campuses. They needed to make decisions by July. They were starting in August. So so that whole decision-making process, and we were doing everything by Zoom. For example, the chancellors and I, for the first couple of months during the pandemic, would have twice weekly Zoom conference calls at 7:30 in the morning, just to go through what problems people were having, what they were doing about them, what our financial status was, and all of that. And then we were able finally to reduce the frequency of those calls to once weekly. We had to work with the Regents, and we actually had Regents meetings beginning in March, totally by Zoom. You know, thank goodness we had that technology available, and that ability to stay in communication with each other. But there were days when I would be on a Zoom call at 7:30, and I was on them constantly until 7:30 at night. You'd be exhausted. And then you'd get up the next morning and do it again. But there were just so many decisions that needed to be made and are still being made throughout the university.
The university, it was helped by some of the stimulus packages that came out of Congress, and right?
Right.
I was going to say, and were you expecting some more help from the next stimulus proposal, which today was basically called off by President Trump?
Yes, we were, in part because the way they wrote the state budget, they reduced the allocation to the university by almost 10%. But if there were another COVID bill, that provided money to the state, that 10% would be refunded, and there would actually be an increase in the university's budget. Now we know the president today yanked any consideration of a COVID bill until after the election. And so in addition to the extra costs and other things that have been incurred by the campuses, there's going to be a real budget cut.
One final question on this pandemic issue. With the pandemic, students and faculty, of course, as you mentioned, have adapted to distance learning. Once the pandemic is over, do you anticipate that we can expect more hybrid learning, more of a hybrid learning model moving forward?
Yeah, I think that we've learned a lot through this period of remote learning. I do think one of the things we've learned is the value placed on being in person on campus, interacting with your fellow students, interacting with faculty, all of the extracurricular activities and so forth that go on. And so I think once it's safe to do so, the campuses will resume campus life in that way. However, having now learned a lot about distance learning, remote learning, et cetera, I think that's not going to go away. And I do expect that the campuses will offer many more courses that are hybrid in nature than they did prior to the pandemic.
So instead of squeezing into Wheeler Auditorium, for example, with I don't know how many hundreds of students, you might be able to watch a lecture from home.
You might be, and even have a small discussion section from home in a chat room, and you know, all of the other things that one can do using this technology. You know, one of the things we did during this period of remote learning, one of the things we had to do was to make sure that students had access to technology so that they could continue making progress toward their degrees. And so different campuses did different things, but many of them purchased laptops for students who didn't have laptops. And they purchased Wi-Fi hotspots for students who didn't have good broadband access. There was a real effort made to ensure that students could continue you know, receiving the educational content that they needed and that they could continue making progress toward their degrees.
Plus on some campuses, you have students who are homeless.
Right, and you know, even though we closed the dorms, we did keep them open for students who had nowhere else to be. And so students who were homeless, international students, students who may have been in the foster care system, and so the campuses were never 100% empty.
You alluded to this a little bit earlier in terms of working with the legislature and other constituencies. We all know the University of California remains the most complex and accomplished university in the world, and its global research is second to none. We just got, by the way, 2 more Nobel Prizes today, one at Berkeley and one at UCLA. So congratulations.
Yeah, it brings our total to 67. Pretty darn impressive.
It is. Yet the level of state support, as we all know, is a fraction of what it used to be, and it seems to be going down every year. Obviously, there's a lot of competition for state funds, but do you think lawmakers really appreciate what the university does for the state?
You know, that's something we kept trying to communicate with the legislature, that dollars spent at the University of California were an investment that returned multiples over time. That the students we educated became leaders, became taxpayers, that there are whole swaths of the California economy that come out of research at the university. the high-tech industry, the movie industry, the wine industry. When the University of California was founded, the notion was that any student in California, academically qualified, would have access to a high quality education without the need to go back to the East Coast and be in an Ivy League. And that investment, in that sense that the investment in the University of California was an investment that would benefit us all, was a real sense behind the University of California. It's one of the reasons why UC remains the best public research university in the country. But I do worry that its value is underappreciated at the legislature, and that the need to invest in it is being shortchanged. I think that's a real concern.
And this, of course, is where UC alums can help.
Absolutely. You can join the UC Advocacy Network. Any communication from an alumni to a legislator, it all matters. And it all helps communicate that the University of California has a broad base of public support.
So we all know the financial benefits of enrolling out-of-state students. They pay higher tuition. But in recent years, I will say with a strong nudge from the legislature, you've made a concerted effort to boost enrollment of California students. How is that working out?
Yeah, so we really increased in-state enrollment. We have the highest in-state enrollment ever in the history of California. We also reached an agreement with the legislature that our campuses would not exceed 18% in out-of-state enrollment, with a few campuses who were higher than 18% grandfathered in and capped, so they couldn't keep increasing out-of-state enrollment. And I think we're getting to the point where the campuses are pretty darn full, and so continuing to increase enrollment at the same rate that we have over the past 7 years, I think it needs to slow down.
And that leads to my next question. Along those lines, as you know, that California has a master plan for higher education. It's 60 years old now. It's been updated. And it says that California residents, students in the top 1/8 in the statewide graduating class from high school should be offered a place somewhere in the UC system, not necessarily the campus of their first choice. And you also have to make space for qualified community college students to transfer in, because that's part of the master plan also. Is there sufficient capacity to deal with these mandates?
So yeah, we were actually accepting students from the top 15%. So we were more than meeting our master plan goal. And the master plan also suggests, and we agreed with then Governor Brown, that for every 2 freshmen that we took, we would take 1 community college transfer student. And we've met that goal as well. But as I said, the campuses are getting pretty darn crowded. And so I think some long-term enrollment planning needs to be done. We need to look at the demographics of California and what they're changing, and what is that going to mean for student demand. What has this pandemic done to out-of-state enrollment? What has the Trump administration done to international student enrollment? So those factors all need reassessment.
Might an 11th campus be on the table?
I don't think so. Not in the near term, for sure. Building a UC campus is a really expensive proposition. And we just completed Merced. Merced has capacity, and that means we still have room to grow. But the really high demand campuses, the Berkeleys, the UCLAs, they're about at the maximum that they can take. So where we can continue to offer all students who meet the qualifications a place at the UC, we certainly can't offer it to them if their only choice is to go to Berkeley.
Right. So on next month's ballot, we have Proposition 16, which would reinstate affirmative action, which was banned by the voters in 1996. The UC Regents recently went on record supporting affirmative action, but not race and gender quotas in terms of hiring or admissions or contracting. So with or without Proposition 16, how do you think all this plays out in the upcoming years?
Well, I think it's interesting. I just saw some recent polling that Proposition 16 is way behind in the polls. It's kind of surprising to me. But here's the way I look at it. We do something called holistic admissions at the UC, meaning that we look at 14 different factors about a student to see what they can contribute if they become a member of the UC community. And it just seems to me kind of a false limitation that one thing we cannot consider is something central to a student's identity, and that's their race and ethnicity. And so it seems to me if we're going to have holistic admissions, we ought to be able to take that into consideration. And that means that what was then Prop 209 should be repealed.
Hasn't minority enrollment gone up in the last several years?
It has. It has.
Without affirmative action?
It has, without affirmative action. But it's still not commensurate with the population of high school graduates. So that, for example, I think now, last year, the largest ethnic group admitted to the UC were Latinos for the first time. And I think it was like 27% of the freshman enrollees are Latino, but the percentage of high school graduating seniors who are Latino is close to 50%. So we have a mismatch there. With respect to African American students, lower numbers, but the same mismatch. So roughly 4% of the newly enrolled students system-wide are African American, but they're close to 6.5% of the high school senior graduating class.
So without using quotas, you would like, correct me if I'm wrong, you would like to see the overall enrollment to fairly closely match the population of California or the demographics of the students graduating?
I wouldn't put it that way, because you run the danger of people saying, well, you need an exact match. But what I would say is that when you have a mismatch, as we do at the UC, it indicates that you may not be reaching out to all the qualified California high school students and, in a way persuading them that coming to the University of California is a good thing to do. And that you have some work to do in that regard.
You mentioned this earlier, and I want to get a little more in depth on it. What is the future of the SAT and the ACT, those testing requirements at the university? I mean, you're doing away with them?
Yep. The Regents voted in May that we would be test optional for this year and next year, meaning that students can submit a score if they so desire, not required to do so. They can't be penalized for not submitting a score, but if they submit one, it's kind of an additive factor to their admissions. In years, 2023, 2024, we would be test blind, meaning that if students submit a score, it can be used for things like course placement, but not for the admissions decision itself. And then by 2025, we won't take the SAT at all.
So your criteria, I mean, you have 14, as you mentioned, 14 different criteria. One of them not being after 2025, one of them not being the SAT or the ACT.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. You once said that the position of president of the university is a great platform to address large public issues. And you talked about what the university is doing in terms of carbon emissions and things like that. What would you consider to be some of those larger issues that you and the Board of Regents have championed?
Well, one is DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That was a program actually started when I was Secretary of Homeland Security. It protects young people who were brought here, typically under the age of 6, who have grown up in the United States, you know, have done everything we've asked of them, have gained admission to the UC, et cetera. But they're undocumented. And if they are enrolled in the DACA program, they cannot be deported and they get work authorization. The Trump administration tried to rescind that program, and we were first out of the gate to sue the administration to enjoin that rescission of DACA. I think making me the only cabinet secretary to have actually sued her immediate successor. But we got that injunction. That case went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and we prevailed by a 5-4 vote with Justice Roberts writing the opinion for the court. So that was an important one. We've been heavily engaged on Title IX issues. And even as we have been reforming and perfecting our Title IX processes, we've been contesting the way that the administration wants to change those processes. We've lost that one. The administration has issued a new final rule on Title IX, and obviously we have to comply with that. But that's been an important battle, and we still have work to do in the area of, you know, sexual harassment. That was a problem that was allowed to fester for too long, and we really want to, you know, to be a model university system for how those difficult cases are handled. So that was a second one. And then the third I mentioned earlier, which is our stance on climate change. We have immense research capability within the UC faculty on all aspects about climate change. We actually have a course called Bending the Curve, which is an interdisciplinary course about 10 scalable solutions to reduce the warming of the planet. But climate change affects a lot of campus operations. And so making those operational changes so that we are good stewards of the environment and are leading in that score was also an important public policy point for us.
I've read regarding the Board of Regents that they aren't necessarily too inclined to use their power of pension fund investments, for example, to affect these larger issues. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, for example, I think they've been urged, to take your investments out of, I don't know, out of tobacco companies or oil companies or whatever.
Yeah, so they have removed their investments in fossil fuels, and they didn't label it divestment. That's kind of in a way, a pejorative term, not all that useful, but just based on a risk analysis of where our dollars are best spent, the decision was made by the investments committee to remove them from fossil fuels. So those changes have been met. And when we do investments, we follow the United Nations and ESG principles, environment, sustainability, and I think good governance. I forget what the G stands for. We were one of the first universities to sign on to those principles.
So before I end my portion of this program, I want to ask you a final question. Michael Drake, as you know, who has served the university for 3 decades, is now in the job as your successor. As you were the first woman president of the university, he's the first African-American president. And before you left office, did you have any advice for him?
Michael is enormously experienced, and unlike me, had a lot of experience in the UC system. He'd been chancellor at Irvine for 9 years. He had been on the faculty at UCSF. He had actually been the vice president for all of our health sciences, hospitals, and schools in the office of the president. He had just come out of leading Ohio State, which is one of the nation's larger public universities. I just told Michael, it's a challenging time, and the university needs you right now.
All right. Well, Professor Napolitano, thank you very much for making time for us. I know as UC president, you can't play favorites among the 10 campuses. But you're no longer president. You now are a professor at Cal. So as I turn it back to Gary, I'd like to offer a hearty Go Bears.
Absolutely. Go Bears.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Steve. Thank you so much, Steve, for the great job moderating, and Janet, for all of your answers and your candid answers and the information. I know that we did have a couple of questions from the audience here that came in. Steve Scott, did you've got those listed? Do you want to? I know Patty had a question, and I think Andy had a question.
Yeah, we have a couple. And if I may, let's see, first question is from Patty, who asks, what do you think is the U's biggest challenge this year and next year and in the next 10 years?
For the university?
Yes.
I think obviously the big challenge for this year, and I think next year as well, will be COVID and the effects of COVID on the ability of the university to resume in-person instruction, on the financial impact on the university, and it's just an enormously challenging time for the system. I think over the next 10 years, I think a large challenge for the university is building up the public support for it, so that larger appropriations emanate from Sacramento. And that's important in part because, we want to keep tuition down. In-state tuition only went up once when I was president, went up by 2.5% one year. So that's a 2.5% increase over 7 years. And we also provide financial aid so that students and families that make less than $80,000 a year pay no tuition. That's 57% of the in-state student body, pay no tuition. But if we want to continue to do that and offer a UC education of the quality that the UC is renowned for, it takes resources, and the state needs to provide more.
We also have a question from Andy, who asked, what do you see as Berkeley's role within the 10 campus community system?
So Berkeley is, it's such a great campus. And I think Berkeley's role is in many respects is to continue to lead and to lead by example in terms of the combination of academic excellence along with student access. I think that it can lead on some of the more complicated issues like the diversity of the student body and the faculty, which is a big issue within the university system. But Berkeley was the first campus, and it ought to be the leading campus.
Thank you. That's it. Everyone was shy tonight, so we have a few questions.
Yeah. Any other questions? You can go ahead and if you want to put those into chat or put it into the Q&A, which you can find the access to chat if you don't see it, and the Q&A at the bottom. You kind of roll your cursor over the screen, and you should see chat and Q&A there. Or you can raise your go to, I think it's reactions, and raise your hand, or however. But if you have any other questions? All right.
Maybe.
Well, okay. Well, then I'm just going to ask you, now that you're on the Berkeley campus and you're here, when things are, of course, are back, hopefully sooner than later, will we see you at football games?
Oh yeah, I absolutely intend to go to the games, and I hope to make my way down to Lair the Bear occasionally.
Well, I hope so. Well, you and I were up there when you spoke a few years ago, and we took you on the tour of the Lair, and I remember that you fell in love with it at that time, and we're just unfortunate we couldn't go this year. But yeah, we'll definitely see you up there again.
Yeah, disco bingo,
Disco bingo, there you go. Yeah.
Gotta do it.
Yep, that was a sight to see. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and close things up here. First of all, I'd like to, of course, thank Professor Napolitano for taking time to join us today. This is something I've been trying to do for a few years to get her to come up to Sacramento. And unfortunately, the calendars and timing and things just never cooperated with us. So she wasn't able to join us, but I jumped on it. I knew we were going to be on Zoom, which would make the timing a lot easier. So thank you so much for spending the time and for joining us here today. Loved having you, and I hope you will come back. You are always welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd also very much like to thank Steve Swatt, our moderator, who did just a great job. I was so glad when I called him that he was available and willing to do this, because I just really didn't know who else we would have that was seasoned and up to the task. And great job, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Anything for a golden bear.
Anything for a golden bear. That's what we like to hear. And also like to thank Steve Scott, who was quiet in the background there, but making sure that everything was running properly on Zoom, and monitoring the chat and making sure everything happened correctly. This, as I said, this has been recorded, so I will have hopefully shortly the link if anybody would like to see see it again, or to share it with anybody. Let me know, and I'll put out some information. And one other thank you, I'd like to thank Adrienne Falk, who was working with Janet and helped me out immensely. She was my main contact and got all the logistics set up to make this happen. So I know she isn't on a board with us anymore on the webinar. But if Janet, you could please express my gratitude to her. It was she made this whole thing very easy and seamless.
Very good. I absolutely will do that.
All right. Well, with that, we will see you actually beforehand. I don't have an exact date yet, but I know that with the grid club meetings that are going to be happening before the games, as we bring them up, they will be on Zoom, working on getting speakers. I did get, although we haven't nailed a date down, so they may be like tonight, they may be on a different night other than Wednesday. We're a little more flexible with the schedule, but I did get an okay for our typical opening. We're not sure what day yet, but before the first game, we'll hear from Jim McGill, who always gives us a great rundown on the season, are going to be our 7-game season, hopefully. And then again, on, I believe it's November 10th, we will have Chancellor Christ with us. So make sure you put those on your calendar. And with that, I think for everybody that joined in on the webinar today, and we're going to continue to perfect this and get any bugs worked out that we may have had. And also try to get them streaming on YouTube to make it a little easier to join in that way as well. So I'm going to, with that, do what I always find is the most awkward part of anything on Zoom is closing it out. So it's always kind of, when do I stop? So I'm going to stop here. Again, thank you, everybody. And go Bears.
Go Bears.
Okay. Good night.
Night.
Steve, you're on mute.
I know, rookie mistake. I guess we're out. Going to go okay.
Yeah, I think so. I wish there were more people. We had 46 signed up, and we had 17 plus the panelists. So
well, we may find out later if people had technical issues, but because someone just phoned in. But anyway, hold on a second. Let me.